influence to vote should be from within and not from without. So I want to set you at ease that you don't need to affiliate or unaffiliate as a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, if that's how you see yourself, and I certainly hope so. But that doesn't automatically mean that you are part of some box that you're being placed in. So I want you to enjoy the freedom that you have. It's a beautiful thing. With that freedom comes a responsibility. And you guys, I know I'm preaching to the choir, because you guys feel a burden and a responsibility to be involved in this process. Because you are the people. And the power is vested in the people in this nation of ours. Never forget that. No matter how you've been talked down to or dismissed, you have the power to lead this nation. And anybody who says differently is a liar. And I know people who lie to themselves all the time to say, my vote doesn't matter. And it does, because you hold great power that very few in the rest of this world have. You wield it, so wield it well. Be thoughtful and prayerful about it. How do you feel, Stacy, about the state of our nation?
I know that it's confused. I know it's without God as a foundation and our rock. I know that the enemy is lurking around, looking to devour and has devoured. But I know that there's division, but I also know that God is here and He wants to be in the Capitol. He wants to be, he wants to be talked about more than politics. He wants to be talked about.
Vince, here's a question for you. What is your understanding, but more so your operating understanding of the separation of church and state?
So the separation of church and state is a very interesting and long-term. A lot of people think that it's in the Constitution. Those words aren't actually in there. It comes from one of the Federalist Papers. But the essential idea is, at its founding, the United States didn't want to be a place where you need to have religious tests for office. For instance, like only Calvinists could be president or only Catholics or that sort of thing. It comes from our American founding, where a lot of the initial colonies, for instance, Maryland was a haven for Catholics, Massachusetts was for Puritans. Like a lot of people who were fleeing religious persecution of one form or another came to the United States. And then as we grew as a nation, it went from being a place where just Christian sects would be respected to where any religious group, including those who had no religion, had the ability to practice their faith freely without government interference. You can't really understand freedom of church and state without going back to what things were like. Like the whole Bill of Rights is, if you look at it, it's kind of weird because it's a bunch of stuff that's just like, oh, we're not going to do this because this was done to us. Things of that nature. So when we talk about the First Amendment, like freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, these are all things that have been prevented. So in England, Catholics weren't allowed to hold office, own property, all sorts of things like that. And the same thing for other religious groups in other countries. So bring it back to the modern context, what separation of church and state means to me now is that you have your political sphere and your private sphere, and that actions undertaken by one should not impact the other in a negative way. Like the government should not be dictating what is and isn't allowed to be said in sermons, for instance. And the basic compromise that's been made on that is something called the Johnson Amendment. We don't need to get into that too much, but what it did mean is that preachers can't make endorsements from the pulpit saying like, well, you need to vote, let's say, libertarian, or you're kicked out of the congregation, that sort of thing. But on a more practical level, what it really means to me is that we live in a country in which your faith, it can be as public or as private of a matter as you want. And that is something that's been very rare in human history, and I think something worth preserving.
He's so smart.
I just talk a lot.
No, and it is for your protection. It's become a bludgeon to silence, which it never was intended. It was to protect people of faith or people of not faith from mandates from the government, which would be an overstep here, but it's common almost everywhere else. So we live in a unique freedom, and again, that is worth preserving. So, the first question, who's going to get this thing started, undaunted, come up to the microphone and ask a question? And again, yes, sir, we'll come up. And for the sake of those joining online.
Hi, my name's Dino Calamus, and my question is help in understanding, I'm going to say it's number 123 in the ballot for dedicated revenue for affordable housing programs. You know, everybody's advertising, I shouldn't say everybody, there's a lot of advertising that says it won't raise taxes. But it's all based on requirements from other revenues. And is that valid? Are they going to say it will never raise taxes? Or right now, because we're getting Tabor funds and other things, taxes aren't going to be raised? You know?
So that's a very good question. A few housekeeping things on that. So Proposition 123, for those of you who have a blue book, you should have gotten one of these in the mail. It's this really long thing. Proposition 123 is something that was put on the ballot by the voters. So, you know, the people who ask you to sign something outside of a King Soopers, that sort of thing. If you get enough signatures, it's a lot. It's like 10,000 valid signatures in each congressional district, which is difficult to attain. But you get enough of those and you can put something on the ballot. And that means that everyone gets to vote on whether or not this should be made law. So this isn't something that people in the Capitol were voting on. This is something that everyone here is deciding to sort of skip the Capitol and put into law directly. But to the meat of your question as to whether or not this will raise taxes, Colorado has something called Tabor, the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, which means that we cannot raise taxes without putting it to a vote. So what this does is, rather than raise taxes as far as in like we're going to raise your income tax or sales tax or something like that, it is reallocating money that is already in the general budget. And the details are, there's all sorts of formulas and stuff in it. But basically, because it does not explicitly raise taxes, it is not subject to Tabor. There's not a Tabor refund thing in there that says specifically, like, if you do this, it'll take your refunds away. As a bit more of a personal note on it, I like the idea behind Tabor. I can't say what I wouldn't vote for. I think the impulse behind it is good because it allows people to have a say in whether or not their taxes are raised, but it does lead to a lot of sort of chicanery as far as how you fund things. Everyone here has had their fees go up on things instead of their taxes because fees aren't subject to Tabor. And the reason this is so complicated and so asininely long is because of Tabor. It's because what people want is more funding to go to affordable housing. They don't feel like that is something that's going to be possible to achieve through just a straight vote to raise taxes. So what they're saying here is that we are going to take money that is already collected in the general fund and allocate more of it, a specific amount, to housing, to affordable housing. Whether or not that will be effective, I don't know. The amount of money they're talking about here is kind of a drop in the bucket compared to housing prices. Everyone who owns a home or has rented or is looking to buy a home, you can just go on Zillow and see how much more it's worth now than it was 5 years ago. I think the amount of money they're talking about here is going to be hard-pressed to make a big dent in that. What I will say, though, is that a lot of people my age and younger who are looking to buy a home are having a really hard time finding starter homes that are priced at the affordable metric, which is usually a third of your income and below. The idea that you're going to be able to raise your income enough to get the 20% down payment seems impossible to a lot of people, and that's what this is really meant to address. Like, we're going to take state money and try and make it easier for people to buy homes. I don't know how effective it's going to be. State action is only one part of it, and there's a lot of other state actions that are going to make it more difficult. Things like zoning, things like minimum parking requirements, things like density. So I think the impulse behind it is good, but to answer your question very specifically, it is correct legally in saying that it will not raise your taxes this year. It does not say, however, that the money that they take from whatever other program they're going to have to cut it from to fund this will not end up being made up with some further thing down the line.
Actually, that was a big concern, because if the revenue reduces because of anything from inflation to loss of revenue, and this is in effect, then it's got to reduce something. So even though it's not raising taxes, as you said earlier, to offset anything and I'm not saying anything bad about it,
Dino?
to offset the funding for this, for, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry.
Just recapping his question at this point, it was, if I may, that your concern is that because this allocates a specific amount of money from the budget, it has to come from somewhere, and that shortfall might have to be made up somewhere else by.
Yes, that's correct. And basically, this is in effect for how long?
So technically, as a statutory measure, it's in effect until either it wears out in the statute itself, if it has a sunset clause, or some subsequent statute changes it. The difficulty here is that just because it was put on the ballot by us, the voters, doesn't mean that it cannot be amended later by acts that are not just from the voters, because it's just changing a statute. They can't just repeal it right away, but that doesn't mean they can't pass subsequent statutes that allocate other funds different ways. The fact that we have, it's called the progressive era reforms, things like direct election of senators, recalls, referendums, initiatives, all that kind of stuff, means that we have a pretty tangled web as to who gets to decide stuff in Colorado. It means you get a really big blue book and a really long ballot, but it also means you have a really big say compared to people in other states.
Okay. And this is going to be controlled by a committee, or who controls the allocation of these funds?
So that would go through the legislative process in kind of in the same way where there are discretionary and non-discretionary funds. This would mean that they have non-discretionary funds. They need to put at least, I don't remember the number offhand, I think it says like 190 million or something, don't quote me on that, but whatever it says in there, they have to put at least that much towards affordable housing programs. And then whatever else is in the budget, they have to raise or lower to meet that cap. The idea behind, like, this isn't going to hurt the budget is that the government gets revenue from taxes, and as economic growth increases, they will get more money each year without having to raise taxes, a more total amount of money, not percentage-wise.
Good deal. And that was the key I was looking for, economic growth. Because if there's no economic growth, then if it's a statutory funding, then that's going to decrease from other things.
On a relative basis, yeah. Like if you have a X amount, if the rest of the budget is made percentage-wise and this is made in terms of raw dollars, then yes, this would stay the same, but everything else would have to shrink to meet that.
And I didn't read it, but in case, is there anything that addresses creating affordable housing in this issue? Because, right now, it's not that, I understand the plight. I'm fighting affordable housing. But in a bigger picture, is affordable housing not available because of prices being overpriced, or because there's not enough houses, or there's a lack of income?
So that's more of an economics question than a political one, which I'm happy to take a stab at.
Okay.
But the basic answer on that would be, so the where this money comes from is by decreasing the Tabor refunds. It's not raising your taxes, it's just decreasing the excess that would go to you. But
It's like
Yeah.
$60, yeah.
yeah, so less money is coming to you in years where there is a Tabor refund. We don't always have one. We had a pretty big one this year because there was a big budget windfall. But the biggest problem we have right now in the housing market is inflationary. There's just not enough housing around. And the way you control inflation is by decreasing the amount of money that's being spent. So, and it's here in the book, one of the arguments against it is that it's just giving more money to people's pockets that they're then spending, which then increases inflation. It's real cyclical. So
Good deal. Oh, sorry.
I don't know how it's going to work.
Why don't they use the money from the marijuana to do that?
To do the housing?
Yeah, why don't they use that?
So the money that comes from marijuana taxes that we implemented back in 2012 is not going straight to the general fund. It's allocated to specific programs. One of those is called the BEST program, Better Education Schools, something. Giving you, like, building schools in rural districts, that kind of thing. So it's not just a flood of money that the state can do whatever they want with. It was actually very similar to this, in that it was a voter-passed thing that said, you're going to raise money doing this thing that's going to go towards these specific programs. So while there may, I don't actually have the number offhand, how much marijuana tax is raised, that money's not available for this because it's already been earmarked for something else.
All right. Next question, next person. And thank you, Dino. Next question, please. All right, Alan. Hold on. Oh, okay, you're going to race then. Go ahead, my friend. All right, Russ.
Okay, right before we came, my wife asked me this question, and it's one that I have not taken the time to research, but how do you find out or intelligently figure out whether you should retain a judge or not? For anybody. This question is for anybody.
I'm happy to take a stab at that if you want. So another thing that's very complicated because of the way we do things. So we don't vote on judges here, but we vote to retain judges. So judges get put in place through actually a pretty complicated process where there is a judicial nominating commission that is made up of 7 members. No more than 4 can be from the same party. So what that usually means is you get 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and 1 unaffiliated. They put forth a list of 3 people they think are qualified. The governor then appoints of those 3 people who they think should be there. It's a little different because we have municipal judges and district judges and appellate judges and Supreme Court judges, that sort of thing. But the flip side of the Judicial Nominating Commission is what's called the Judicial Performance Commission, and that is comprised very similarly where, X amount of Republicans, X amount of Democrats, and what they do is they go through and they're not all attorneys, but some of them are, and they go through and look at what the decisions a judge has made, not just on the bench, but in their conduct. Like if you have somebody who got a DUI or was sexually harassing somebody from the bench or all sorts of bad behavior sort of things, they will review that and put it in their judicial performance report. Now that's in the Blue Book as well as some other stuff, but it's a designed system to try and prevent the very thing that you're asking about, because most of us don't interact with judges. Most of us certainly aren't qualified enough, legally speaking, to say if they're making the right decision or not. And frankly, we don't have the time to sit through and dig through, 50, 100, 200, depends. I mean, if there's a municipal judge who's hearing like traffic tickets, they can see thousands of people a year. So the idea that we're going to be able to, as voters, read through each of those and make a decision if they're the right person for the job or not is really hard. So what the Judicial Performance Commission does is they set up standards. It's like, well, this person meets those performance standards, they're behaving and ruling the way we think a judge should, or they're not. Right now, all of the judges on the ballot in the state of Colorado have met performance standards. So according to the bipartisan commission, none of the judges here have committed acts that they think disqualifies them from serving. Now, there are some people who believe that you should just vote no on all judges or vote yes on all judges. The arguments for that are basically voting yes on all judges is like, well, I don't know enough and I don't really feel qualified to determine if someone should be a judge or not. And people who vote no on all of it, it's like, well, I don't like the way that the legal profession is working in this state. I think our justice system needs some fresh blood. We're going to start over, get all the sort of deadwood out and replace it with new people. On a more personal note, what I will say is that I tend to agree with the people who work on Judicial Performance Commission. I know a lot of them. They're generally people who have dedicated their lives to public service. Like somebody like Stacy would be a perfect example of the sort of person who is on a Judicial Performance Commission. There's someone who cares about the community. There's somebody who's knowledgeable, if not in the legal stuff itself, in how a judge should act and how a judge should interact with the people in the community, because they're not kings, they're people who work for us, they're civil servants like everyone else. So usually the only way someone will get a negative review from the Judicial Performance Commission is if they do something particularly egregious. That can be the sort of things that will end them up in prison, like murder, assault, that sort of thing, or the sort of stuff that just gets really bad press because it's not how a judge should behave, things like sexual harassment, sexual assaults, DUIs, that kind of thing. So none of the people on the ballot to be retained as judges have committed offenses like that, but other than that, you have to sort of get into the ideology of a judge, and that's really hard to parse because judges don't have a party associated with them that you can, like usually if you're a Democrat or a Republican, you can look at the letter behind someone's name and go, okay, because they're on my team, I can largely assume they're gonna act the way I want them to. With judges, we don't have that because ideally judges aren't political, they're judicial. And I wish I had a better answer for you, but the best one I can have is, in my experience, the judicial performance recommendations are pretty solid. And if you do want to vote somebody out, the difficulty is you don't get to vote on their replacement. It's not like a recall election. The person who's being removed from the bench is just going to be, his or her seat will be filled by the same process that put them in place. So you can't pick your own judges. You can just pick which ones you want to fire.
Which admittedly might not be the best system in place. However, it does give the power of review, and the legal community does take the review, especially of ethics, quite seriously at all levels. And those who are on the bench, they take it very seriously. And the appellate judges have a very difficult job, and it is a very closed system of how the Court of Appeals functions. It is a small fraction of even practicing attorneys, that would ever stand before the Colorado Appellate Court so to argue things. And even then, their job is just to decide whether the law was accurately applied. It's not a fact-finding court. And so they have a very hard job. Nobody's happy with them in the legal community because at some point everybody's losing. And that's just how that works. But yeah, I think the review is a really good way to do it. And I love the fact that we have an opportunity to say, okay, how did we get here? And who are those people who are making those decisions? And maybe it's time for a change. And if there's a change in the people who are ultimately making that decision, like if it's being ratified by a governor, for instance, then a change there could have some trickle-down effect. But by the time it gets there, these folks have typically been vetted over and over and over again. And so, like Vince is saying, it would have to take something pretty egregious, but also something that could be so politically charged you would probably know about it. If you know nothing about it, then they've been just doing their job each and every day in a pretty toxic environment, and they've been at it all the time. So they deserve our thanks, but they also deserve a review from the people.
One last thing I would add is, unlike the Supreme Court, the federal Supreme Court, for the Colorado Supreme Court, there are mandatory retirement ages. So you don't have to worry about somebody, the goal behind it is that you don't have to worry about someone serving well past the point where they would feel appropriate and healthy serving because they don't want somebody else to replace them. As soon as you get on the board or the Supreme Court, like, okay, I retire at 72, so I know exactly how long I'm going to be here. And that removes one thing that a lot of people worry about from the federal level about judges, is that it's turned into sort of political brinkmanship of forcing well-meaning old people to serve for a really, really long time in the hopes that they can be replaced by somebody they want. Here, they don't have that option. You can't change your birthday.
And also, I wanted to do a little bit more research. So Vince gave me a website. There's a website that you can go to if you want to look a little bit more into the judges. Was it Judicial Colorado?
So it's the same information that's in the Blue Book with just a little bit easier to access. And so if you just Google Colorado Judicial Performance Evaluations, it'll be like judicial.colorado.gov. Something, yeah. But it's like the top result if you Google it, so you should be easy enough to find.
All right. Alan.
Does Colorado have to balance a budget like we would our checkbooks? Or can they pretty much do and find money elsewhere?
So the short answer is yes, Colorado has to have a balanced budget statutorily. The difficult thing in explaining that is, so if Colorado collects more money than it is supposed to, you get a Tabor refund. So that means like any excess amount beyond the statutory calculation on how much they're allowed to get goes back to the taxpayer. So that's why we all got a check for, however much it was, 700 something per person. Now, where it gets a little difficult is Colorado can't raise taxes on its own without a vote of the people, but we get money from a lot of different sources. The main reason we got a big Tabor refund this year is because of COVID relief money from the feds. Some of that went directly to the voters themselves or citizens themselves through direct checks to people. Much more of it, we're talking like a fire hose of cash, went to various state agencies. But before it went to the state agencies, it went to the state government itself. So if the feds want to do something, rather than try and reinvent the wheel, it's like, okay, well, who's helping with homelessness in Colorado? Then they'll just give that money to whatever agency is already doing that work on the ground here. So in theory, we have to balance our budget. But on a practical level, if there's economic growth that brings in more money than we otherwise have, and the feds give us more money than we otherwise have, there are ways to get more money than we're supposed to. And that's what things like 123 that we were talking about before, or a Proposition CC from a few years back, are ways to try and decrease the amount of money that goes back to the taxpayer by keeping more of that in state hands to do with what they want. But the short answer is the state cannot run up debt the way the federal government can, not only because it can't print money, but it can't issue the same kind of bonds. So Colorado is one of the few states that has to have a more balanced budget. So it's much closer to a sort of domestic household budget, but it's not quite the same because you and I can't count on a bunch of federal money to come in.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Questions? Comments?
Oh, come on, I didn't do that good a job.
Anybody having questions on Propositions 1, 24, 25, and 26?
So those are the alcohol-related ones. Sure. So a little bit of housekeeping again on these. So these are also citizen-driven ballot measures. These didn't come from the state legislature. These came from people collecting signatures, ironically outside grocery stores for the most part, because one of them deals with grocery stores. Those of us who lived in Colorado for a while can remember we had a lot of pretty old-fashioned liquor rules, like you couldn't sell alcohol on Sundays. There was one, like Target or King Soopers or Costco, that sold hard liquor, and everything else was just 3-2 beer, that kind of thing. So because we had those rules on the books, and because they were constitutional back from way forever ago during Prohibition, Colorado's actually dry both before and after Prohibition. That's a whole different story. But because of that, liquor changes are very difficult to do, and they go through our legislative process. So 124, 125, and 126, because it has to be single issue, they could otherwise all be one bill, but they're all just 3 little separate ones. One of them deals with things like DoorDash or Uber Eats, things like that, allowing you, let's say you order from a Mexican restaurant, you get enchiladas, well, you could also order a margarita to go, and they could deliver it. That's currently illegal. This would make it legal. 125 is the one that allows, the way that we recently changed that grocery stores can now sell full-strength beer. This would allow grocery stores to sell wine as well. And 126 is a more technical one that deals with the number of establishments that are allowed to sell beer, wine, and spirits. Right now you need a liquor license to do that, and there is a capped number of liquor licenses the state will issue. So let's say Stacy wanted to start Stacy's Liquors. She could only do that if there was a liquor license available. I'm just saying. So what this would do and there's a table in here that goes through this in detail, but it would slowly raise the cap on the number of liquor licenses that are issued each year until eventually, I think it's in 2037, there's no longer a cap on how many liquor licenses are issued, which essentially you'd still need to be licensed, but there's not a hard cap on how many licenses can be there in the state. Some of the arguments for it are, Colorado has grown an awful lot. Like we have doubled our population in not that long a time, and in that same period, the amount of liquor licenses has not increased. Ergo, it's harder now to find a place that sells liquor than it was back then. Some of the arguments against it are it's not that hard to find a place to buy liquor. And there's some more moral arguments about whether or not the state should be in the business of increasing the amount of people who have access to alcohol, that kind of thing. On a more practical level, though, this doesn't change any of the rules to get a liquor license. You still have to go through all the same tests and regulations. It doesn't change who is allowed to buy or sell liquor. Like you still need to pass a certification to sell liquor, and you still need to be above 21 to buy it. This is really a matter of more, it's not really an ideological question, it's more just personal preference. There are people in the beer and wine industry who are for it, and there are people who are against it. There are small mom and pop shops who are against it, and there are small mom and pops who are for it because they want to get a license to start their own thing, and right now they can't. So it's really just about what kind of relationship you want the state to have to alcohol. A lot of people will vote straight ticket, like yes on all of them, no on all of them, but there's not a huge revenue component that's going to impact your day-to-day life, and there's not really even if there are more licenses available, you still have to go through zoning to decide where a liquor store is going to be. So this is really just changing one small element of our very technical relationship to liquor in the state.
I might add that, and Vince mentioned, an ideological component, but what about, and consider, as you should for all of these things, on a broader scale. So propositions have a way, ballot measures have a way of getting really deep into the weeds. But we also have to take a step back. I think it's important to look very big picture, and that is, and he mentioned it a little bit, what should the role of government be? And you could look at this, well, the government doesn't need to be in the booze business, but that may be one way to look at it. Or ideologically, should the government be curtailing free market? So if there is a market for alcohol or whatever it's going to be, should the government be in the business of restricting that or letting supply and demand, so a free market economy, should the government let it breathe? And so in this instance, you could look from two different perspectives, but at least start to think ideologically about, should the government be restricting the number of retail stores? Should the government say, well, you can buy this, but you can't buy that? Or should you let the market correct itself? And so when you go down that route, you start thinking, all right, I wonder if I'm a libertarian on this one, And so because that ideology politically can send you down a road. And so I want you guys to at least consider why people lean certain ways on certain issues, and whether or not it should be the government that says, well, yeah, you and you can sell this, and that, but you and you can't. So at least consider whether or not supply and demand should be how our economy functions, or should it be dictated by a state, by a municipality. And then does this have an impact on society? And is that impact positive or negative? Having booze delivered to people's doors, is that better for our society? Is it worse for our society? And you think, well, at least they're not driving to go get it. I don't know. There could be reasons, and will it be strictly enforced? I mean, will they have to show the DoorDash guy, and will the DoorDash guy really check to see if that ID is correct? I don't know how many of you ever used a fake ID, but I assure you that the DoorDash guy does not care. And whether Dram Shop Act would kick in anyway if somebody stumbles to the door and you hand them a margarita. Like, you're not supposed to, but now we're letting Uber Eats decide these things, which they're not going to. They don't care. So just consider, and a question that came in, so Prop 122 is about natural medicine, as certain plants are fungi that affect a person's mental health and are a controlled substance under state law.
Mushrooms affect a person's mental health. Since-
Psychedelic mushrooms?
Well, I just you brought it up. I read it, and I wondered, how can mushrooms, and that's what they're talking about.
Because they're powerful compounds. Yes. So this is about, quote, natural medicine. So psychotropic, naturally derived psychotropic drugs. This great state decided to legalize marijuana because the citizens of this great state either voted or just said, no, I don't feel like voting on things. And by that, you cast your vote. So now this is being opened up to psychedelic and psychotropic plants and fungi, correct? In our reading of Proposition 122? Is that what this is about?
Yeah, marijuana was legalized 10 years ago. It's been 10 years.
Yeah.
So are we better off today?
One other thing I would point out on that is this is not something we can look at in a vacuum. This is, as Stacey mentioned, it's been 10 years since we decriminalized and legalized marijuana. That's not the only thing that's been done as far as our classification of previously difficult substances. There was a bill that decriminalized fentanyl back in 2019. That has largely, not entirely, but they took a pretty serious step at undoing that last year, which was interesting because it was essentially the same people who voted one way and then voted the other way. So one of the things we have to be careful of when we make these sorts of decisions is it something that can be easily reversed if things go wrong? If we do this and we find out that, well, we really like it, and it turns out it's super helpful, is that something we want to pursue down the line with other substances? Or if this goes really poorly, is it going to be easy to put the genie back in the bottle? There's arguments both ways. There's arguments as to whether or not and this is just pure me peeking through. I find it weird that I am being asked as a voter to vote on the medicinal quality of substances that not only am I not super familiar with, but I'm also not a doctor. It seems weird to me that we are deciding what things are and are not allowed for doctors to prescribe through a vote of the people. It is, and all this is in the arguments for and against. There are a lot of people who say these sorts of treatments have helped them, but there are no places where these treatments are currently approved in the United States. Do we want to be the first? We were the first with marijuana. That went how it went, for good and for bad. But there's a lot of things that we just don't know what's going to happen. That means we can be pioneers and things are great, or that means we can be pioneers and we're the Donner Party. So you have to figure out what you're going to do.
And it's absolutely right. Consider the long-term effects. Case in point, we legalized marijuana, which most folks are like, smoking weed's probably bad for you. And more of it means more access to it. We had a massive influx of people into the state. Okay, fast forward 10 years, affordable housing, because that massive influx of people directly related to legalizing marijuana. And when we had 2,200 people moving, I think it was 2,200 a week, that might not be accurate, but moving into the state, largely because of the legalization of marijuana, drove demand in excess of supply, and the housing market shot through the roof, which is now pricing out people. So now the government that approved the legalization of marijuana that had a direct impact, and the influx of people is now saying, hey, can we get some more money to make houses more affordable when we artificially inflated the price of housing by creating a higher demand by legalizing weed? And so you can't separate that these things have not only a detrimental effect to someone's health, it could have a positive effect to somebody else. But you can't think that these things will have no effect. Biblically speaking, where I can ring in on things, we are called to be sober-minded. And you can probably, if you can probably have alcohol in a certain amount that you can remain sober. But sobriety is not something that you can maintain by taking psychotropic drugs. So you can't smoke marijuana and be sober-minded like you could in moderation. If you ingest psychotropic mushrooms, you are not going to be sober-minded. Your judgment will be flawed, and I think you are at great risk of making very poor decisions. And if we are to be salt and light and be bastions for what is true, and our behavior should be good and pure, then it is not recommended, right? You're not going to be able to be sober-minded if you're not sober. And so are we aiding people's sobriety, or are we enabling their intoxication from some of these propositions? So do you have a moral obligation to consider these things morally? Absolutely. Is that the only way to think of it? Probably not. You could think of it from an economic standpoint. You could think of it from a societal, but you could also apply your moral directives to these things. And I think that's an important thing for believers to do, because, who else is going to say, this probably isn't good for a society to be more high? More high in more ways. And has it helped out? Do we have a stronger, more with it workforce these days than 10 years ago? Or do we have more stoners? And are they doing well with their life? Well, you need to consider these things on a moral basis, because we have an actually moral objective and moral directive. Because friends, and we have to be loving about this too. And the people who find direct medical benefit, okay, great, fine. Have we done the research on the direct medical benefit of some of these other very powerful psychotropic drugs that happen to grow from the ground? Not a lot of research. And we could use a lot more research on these things, including the long-term effect. Because what we also find out is once you legalize things, the demand for stronger and stronger and stronger goes up. So, 3-2 beer is not strong enough. We need the strong stuff. Now, there's always been stronger alcohol out there. But marijuana, the potency of THC in the modern products being sold are factors stronger than what even was available in the 60s. It doesn't even compare. So we need to be very cautious about making psychotropic drugs more and readily available. So biblically speaking, should you have an opinion on this? Yes, you should. I'm not going to tell you what that is necessarily as far as how to vote, but I will tell you we are called to be sober-minded, and a sober society is a better one. So we can accurately address the problems that our society faces and not just numb it and move on. We need to be clear-minded. That's kind of my stake on this. Joan, yes. Here comes the Joan.
Yeah, here comes the Joan, and I was raised by a libertarian, which affects my vote on those issues over the years. Can we do the research about some people who have deep depression or some of these issues are saying this is helping. Are they legally allowed to do the research? I am with you on why are we making these medical decisions when the medical marijuana was passed? Why was it being distributed, not in doctors' offices, and we had these open? It's just very confusing to me. So, do we before it's passed, do we have the right to do research on it? Do people who have, epilepsy with marijuana or whatever it is, before it was passed as a medical law, did they have the right to have access to that if they needed it, or cancer patients with the marijuana or whatever?
So that's a very good question. And one of the difficulties in not only the way that we're dealing with this particular substance, but the way we did marijuana, there are all sorts of federal rules and regulations on controlled substances as to what you can do with each of them. For an example, for marijuana, the type of marijuana that the FDA allows people to do research on is a very specific, very archaic strain of marijuana that doesn't really represent much of what is being sold and consumed today. It's it's a little like trying to do research on what's best for toddlers by researching, people in a senior citizen's home. You're going to get some information that's useful, but you're not going to get a lot of real world stuff that's helpful in the short term. There are currently, and thankfully this is in the Blue Book, because I didn't actually know this, there are currently studies being done, FDA-approved studies on the use of some of these substances, because it's not just magic mushrooms. It is 5 different psychotropic substances that are discussed in this bill. The FDA has currently not approved anything from those studies for the use by the general public yet. That doesn't mean that they will, doesn't mean that they won't, it just means that they haven't decided yet. So if we decide as a state that we're going to vote for this measure and allow physicians to prescribe these sorts of things or allow individuals to possess these sorts of things without fear of criminal prosecution, we'd be getting out ahead of the FDA. That doesn't mean we're going to come to a conclusion they wouldn't, but it also doesn't mean we're going to come to the conclusion that they will. COVID has given us kind of a warped sense of how quickly the FDA and medical approvals work. Usually they take decades. COVID was different because for basically 2 years, every person who was a professional on this subject had unlimited funds and unlimited attention to pursue one thing. It's kind of remarkable when you think about it that way. But what we're dealing with now is, I don't want to speculate, but it could be years or decades before the FDA makes a decision on this, if at all. So what we have to take into consideration is, are the potential benefits worth us getting out ahead of the FDA on this, or are the potential risks bad enough that we should be more cautious? And that, like Pastor John was saying, it's not just a political question or an economic question, it's a moral question. Like, do you feel like you should have a say on this? And if you do, what do you feel like you should decide and how you should make that decision? Because a lot of times people make decisions that turn out great. A lot of times people make decisions that turn out really bad. So you just have to figure out what values are driving that decision. And, well, Godspeed.
Okay, so Vince, is this more of a local issue?
So the city of Denver did decriminalize mushrooms by to Pastor John's point about the importance of your vote, by sub 1% a few years back, just barely crossed the line through absentee ballots, that kind of thing. So there are local measures that have attempted to do stuff like this before. This is the same thing on a state level. The way that this would impact local control most severely is that cities can't oversee state law. It's called supremacy clause. So basically, Thornton can't say okay, well, you have to be 28 to buy alcohol. It's nope, state says you're 21, you got to allow people who are 21 even if you're in the city of Thornton. So what this would do is create a state law that would make it illegal for, let's say, Thornton to prosecute somebody for possessing either ibogaine, psilocybin, psilocin, dimethyltryptamine, or mescaline. So it is a local issue in the sense that the consequences of it, good or bad, are going to be something that individual communities have to deal with, but it will remove individual communities' ability to legislate these substances as they want, which is what we do for all sorts of things. Most laws are supreme in the state level or federal level.
I know we talked a little bit about the Tabor Act. I was wondering about the Jeffco ballot issue 1A. Is that going to, if it takes away the Tabor, will that give the commissioners the right to lift our taxes without a vote? I'm not sure you had mentioned that, but I wanted to.
Yeah, so Tabor is a state level thing in our state constitution. So you can still not raise taxes, but what they would do, and for those of you who aren't, and I'm again not an expert on this particular issue, for Jeffco specifically, but from how you're describing, it sounds like they're going to take what would be your refund, the money that would go back to you, and keep it and allocate it to the general fund to spend on things. So this is where the legal language is important. They are not technically raising your taxes because the amount you pay is still X%, but you will end up having less money because they are no longer giving you money that was previously refunded to you. So it is not technically a tax increase, but much in the same way that an increased fee is not a tax increase. The end result to your balance sheet is still going to be you will have less money than you would have had otherwise.
Okay. All right, thanks.
And there's also an issue of allocation too. That on the other side is saying like there's a grant for X amount of dollars, but we can only touch up to a certain amount of that grant that was supposed to go to here, and we have to refund it. I think the example, assuming the example is true, the example of the sheriff's office got a grant for $500,000 for body cams, but because they hit their limit, they had to actually refund, $200,000 of that back to the people instead of letting it go where it was supposed to go for the grant that was written for it. And so you get into some really, really technical and sneaky issues about how this money is being used. And in some instances, you think, well, it should go where it's supposed to go. There's also a very easy way to allocate funds in such a way that it all gets sucked up. Like the government is very good at spending money and does not like to give any back, in my experience. Limited.
So on that note, John, if you look at Proposition FF, Healthy Meals for All Public School Students, same concept. Anything that some of that money may not only go to the free lunch program for kids. They may allocate some of it to go into supporting gender identity. So, to your point, the money is not always allocated fully for what they say.
Another thing about FF, just since Stacy brought it up, a lot of these measures will hide things within them that are not super obvious from the front. And not to say that they're hiding it to try and be nefarious, but a lot of the ways these things get funded have cascading effects down the line. Like Measure FF, for instance, what it does is provide free school meals to children. Everyone knows there's literally no free lunch. Somebody has to pay for it. The way that they pay for this is by increasing taxes, but they do it in a specific way because currently Colorado has what's called a flat tax, which means no matter how much money you make, if it's $1 or $1 million, you pay the same percentage of your income. What FF would do is it would raise the money to pay for lunches for kids by removing our flat tax system for the highest earners by saying, okay, you pay your flat tax, but also an additional chunk to pay for this measure. Currently, Colorado has a flat tax. There's been efforts to try and change that. A recent one that some of you may remember was called Colorado Care. We would establish a state healthcare system that would be similar to Obamacare back in 2009, excuse me. That didn't pass largely because people like the flat tax. There's a certain inherent fairness to it that people understand. It's like, well, I don't have to deal with a bunch of different brackets. Filling out your Colorado taxes is much, much easier than filling out your federal taxes. It's just, okay, how much did I make? 4.8% or whatever it is. So something you need to pay attention to is, well, let's say I support or don't support this particular measure. How is it going to be funded if it passes? What is it going to do down the line? Because once you break the flat tax system, it's like, okay, well, sure, we'll make Richie Rich pay a little bit more, and then a little bit more. And then the definition of what a little bit more is and who a Richie Rich is once you've broken the rule as to everyone gets paid the same, you open up Pandora's box as to, well, we can pay as much or as little as we feel like we should vote on. And that's always been the case because there's a tax decrease here right now on the ballot. But again, you have to think, okay, well, sure, I'd like to pay less taxes, but if that decreases the amount of funds the state has, something that they're currently paying is going to not be paid for anymore. And everybody I know wants lower taxes, and everybody I know wants more government services. I get annoyed when I go to the DMV, but hell or high water, I'm not going to pay more taxes for it. And I recognize that's inconsistent, but that's just how I feel. And I think the system works well enough as it is that I personally am not going to want to spend more to fix the DMV, even though it might work. So you have to look through everything, not just its first order effects, but down the line. Like, well, if I get an extra $50 in my pocket, great, but what's going to happen when the state doesn't have $50 from 5 million people? Like, what else is going to happen that's going to make me upset?
Well, I want to make sure we have a little bit of time. We can speak a little more broadly or get into the weeds again. Has anybody found a candidate that sees things exactly how you see it? I mean, and if you have, that's fantastic. That on all the issues that matter to you, you have a candidate with a little bubble beside his or her name where, I mean, they are just right down the list, everything, exactly if it were you. I personally have not, because there are certain people that have, well, I'm like, yeah, we agree on this, this, and this, but we don't agree on that. So would anybody like to share in a very brief way how you vote for somebody that's not exactly like you? Is there a litmus test for these things in your experience? Yeah. Do you have an answer? Come to the mic.
I just vote on things.
Talk to the front of the thing. And then you can squeeze a little thing in the middle if you need to bring it down.
That way the people online can hear you too.
Yep. Thanks, Leslie.
Yes. What was the question? It was about voting.
So if you know that the candidate doesn't see things exactly and always like you do you have a way to evaluate them if they're like close enough to vote for, or the concept of, well, I don't like anybody, I'm voting for the lesser of two evils, like that kind of a concept?
Well, I've never voted for the lesser of two evils. I've voted for the one that was most like
Okay.
in my... But I would never vote for somebody who didn't biblically believe me anymore. I don't know if I'm making...
No, that's good. Elaborate on that just a little bit more.
Well, like, I don't believe in abortion. So if you believe in abortion, or if you're going to vote for abortion, I'm not going to vote for you. You might 50 more things that we agree on, but if you're going to vote for abortion, I'm not going to vote for you.
Is that, people talk about single issue voting, which for some people makes things very clear all of a sudden. Like, I don't care about any of that other stuff. I don't care about the economic impact of this, that, and the other. I don't care much about taxes, this, that, and other, but I do have this moral directive. Would you consider yourself, like, that issue outweighs all of them?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
For me.
Sure.
Anyway, for me.
Cool. Thank you.
If I can take a moment of privilege on that, I think that's a really good question, like how you determine your decision-making process. And something my dad said to me all the time is, so he was at his college graduation, and Roy Disney, who was Walt Disney's brother, was the speaker. And for those of you who don't know, Walt was the idea guy, he was the artist, he was the creative guy. He was like, oh, I want to do this. And Roy was the one who actually, paid the checks and washed the floors and made everything work. And so he was giving his speech, and he had a time for questions afterwards, which I thought was weird when my dad was telling the story, but so be it. And someone asked him, well, how do you make all these decisions every day? Because, he's the head of Disney. He's making hundreds of decisions a day. And is it hard? And Roy Disney said, once you have your values in order, making decisions is easy. And I think about that every day. Like, I know what's important to me. I know what I believe. I know why I believe it. And once you have that rock, everything after that is just extra. Like, if it's, you can call it being a single issue voter, you can call it being, a partisan, you can call it whatever you want, but if you know why you're making decisions, if you know what sort of person you want to be acting on your behalf at the state legislature, county commission, Congress, what have you, like, once you know what matters to you, and once you know who you are as a person and what makes you tick, voting isn't all that hard. I mean, it doesn't mean it's easy, but it does mean it's simple. If you know what matters to you and you know what sort of person you want, all of the other little things that might be disagreements kind of fade away in the light of what's really important. And that's why even someone like Stacy might not be and cannot be an expert on everything. I mean, she can't be a doctor and a lawyer and a physicist and a transportation engineer and everything all at the same time. But if you know that the person you're voting for has the same values as you do and makes decisions the same way you do and prizes the same principles as you do and cares about the same stuff that you do, you can feel confident knowing that that person is going to act in your best interest and act the way that you would if you were in that situation, which is sort of the core part of our democracy, that we're a republic. We pick certain people to act on all of our behalf. And if you know that you're picking the right person, and if you know how you're picking the right person, you really can't make a bad decision.
Here's a question then. Should Christians only vote for other Christians? Okay. Yeah, because I don't know. It's going to be more and more bleak hunting for one to vote for at this current rate. Though, we may have a real resurgence. At some point, the church overall, the church has got to wake up. Now, you guys are very present, but what about, and this is kind of, I don't know about voting strategy. That's probably not the right terminology, but are you able to evaluate somebody, a candidate, whether they would support your moral truths even if they didn't believe them themselves? For instance, many people of faith, even outside of a Christian faith, even outside of, let's say, Protestant evangelical Christian faith, they still have some very moral keys. For instance, like my buddy Aaron Robertson, for many, many years, with the Pillar Project and the Patriot League, talked about 4 pillars of moral truth. And you can evaluate candidates based on those. If you say, okay, these 4 pillars are, say, traditional marriage, parental rights, the sanctity of the unborn, and religious liberty. Okay? So there are actually many people of faith that aren't Protestant Christian, but still support that. That are very devout in their faith, and they support those 4 pillars. And so there are ways to find some common ground, potentially, if you look across some of these others. Racial equality could be a 5th pillar that we actually will fight when we declare as a nation that all men are created equal. Okay, are we actually going to fight for that? Because right after they wrote that, they decided to punt because they couldn't get people to agree of how to enforce, from a rights perspective, are all men created equal? And they punted on the slavery issue. Oh, well, we don't want to split our nation because we can't seem to agree right now. And then that festered for a number of years. But there are ways to morally evaluate based on some of these bigger topics that I think might be beneficial, because you can't vote for the person in the mirror unless you're like Stacy. I agree with all my values. Right. Stacy always agrees with herself except for when she doesn't. So I would say at least consider these things, bigger picture. Why am I voting? Remember that. Why are you voting? And are there ways to hone things down a bit, knowing that will this person support what I support, even if they don't speak exactly like me? Might be helpful. Stacy, comments, questions, things that you've been pondering through this process, things that you've learned that the voter, just the regular us voter, could benefit from your wise counsel?
Yeah, what comes to mind is you don't always know these. A candidate can say they're a believer, but what does that mean? So looking at how they voted in the past, their character, if you can ask people, that will be helpful. But I've met many candidates who have said, I'm a Christian and I'm a believer, and at a different level, I would say. We may agree on one issue, but the rest, not too fond of their character. So there's I would say there's several things to look at when you're looking at a candidate. And if you can get that information, dig and find it.
One thing I would say real quick, because most people I talk to don't actually know this. So the state of Colorado actually has an official motto, which is very, I don't want to say it's perfect, but it's pretty dang close to being perfect for this situation. It's nil sine numine, which means nothing without providence. And in this context, what that really means is, well, we can do anything we want, or rather we can try to do anything we want, but nothing will work without providence. Capital P, providence. Nothing will work without direction and explicit approval from on high. So that is what the people who founded the state of Colorado believed. I am not legally allowed to say if I think that's a good idea or not, but I think it's pretty obvious from what I'm saying. So that's something that I find very comforting whenever I have to go into the drudgery of my job, which is not always the fun part. But it is nice to know that not only the stuff I'm doing is very important and it matters, but also that it's not very important. Because if there's really something that does matter, it's, well, nil sine numine. It's taken care of.
And God has a very long history of putting people in place that the people clamor for. And so when we see people that we don't like and that are oppressive to us, who do you think we as a people put in place? From the very first king, God says, look, you don't need a king, you have me. Oh, we want to be like everybody else. Give us a king. You don't want to do that. Oh, yeah, give us a king. All right, here you go. And God gave them exactly who they were clamoring for. And he was a tyrant and a bit of a loon. And then there was a change, somebody who had more of a heart like God. And that was king number 2. That was David. And so let's be part of the voice that says we want people who are moral and upright and consider the ways of God. I think putting godless people into office is a dangerous game to play. And we've been trying it for various reasons, and it's been a disaster. And the ideology that goes with it is disastrous. And we've seen civil liberties, especially religious liberty, take a beating over the last few years as a result of very heavy-handed policy as a result of very poor voting. And a lot of it is because we had very poor options. And you're voting for people that might not be moral people on either side at all. So we have a chance in a midterm election, which is coming up, to really focus on local. So again, focus on local elections. Most of what affects your daily life is a result of local election, not the election. Vote your conscience. Make sure you vote. And have your voice heard, and consider what you're willing to pray through, because these things matter. And let's involve God in all of the things that we're doing. If you check your Christianity at the voting booth, you will absolutely, and we as a nation will absolutely get what we deserve, and God has a way of putting those people in place. And we don't want more of that. We need less of that. We need people who will support the Constitution, in my opinion, and support biblical values that we've been well served for very long with these. And so, parting words or comments? Ali, do you have anything to share, my brother? Okay. He's one of the smartest guys I know, so I always check in with Ali.
Just because I have not before had the opportunity to live out the childhood dream of being a pastor, other than this exact moment, I will say, I'm glad you brought up the Book of Kings, but you can get into real trouble if you just assume, oh, this next guy's going to fix everything. Because, after David, we had Solomon, and after Solomon, we had Rehoboam, who said, well, don't worry, my father chastised you with whips. I will chastise you with scorpions. And the basic lesson that I always took from that is, well, if you put your faith in the wrong people, things will get bad, and they can always get worse. So remember, everything that Pastor John said was perfect from my understanding, but if you go looking for temporal solutions to eternal problems, you will always be disappointed. So no matter who you vote for or what happens in the election, the ultimate deciding factor between you and the good Lord is still going to be you and what you do. No one can legislate you into heaven or hell. So on that uplifting note, do the best you can.
Okay. Well, let's pray, and we can hang out, and you guys can, I guess, ask the questions that you wanted to ask, but didn't want to get on the microphone. But let's pray. Lord, we thank you for tonight. We thank you just for the opportunity to, again, get together, Lord, to ponder these things. Maybe there's better clarity, but Lord, what you want us to do is to ponder, to involve you in our decisions, to pray a lot, and to pray for those who are fighting for our deeply held, long-standing beliefs, and to rise up in our own conscience, to start obeying our own conscience. We don't have to start a rebellion. We just have to obey you, Lord, to walk rightly and to walk humbly, to love justice. I mean, the basics of what you've called us to do. So, Lord, go with us. Please be with those who are fighting for what is good and right. Give them courage, Lord. And should they be elected, give them even greater courage to stay the course, to be that voice for the people of God moving forward. So we do pray for revival in this country, Lord. We pray that your name would be brought in, Lord Jesus, that your name would be brought back into every corner of every aspect of life, and that we would not check you at any door, that we would have you on our voice openly and proudly to know that we are Christians, people called to this, and we've been called to love one another. So may the church rise up to be the most loving voice, to be salt, light, because we're the only people that have actually been commanded to love one another. Nobody else has that command but us, so may we obey you, to follow your command, to love others as you have loved us. May we take that great call and change this nation for the better. We pray in your name, Jesus. Amen. Amen. Thanks so much, friends. Thanks for writing in, for some good questions. I pray this was beneficial and uplifting, and that it challenges you in other ways. So God bless you. Have a great night. And we're going to hang around, so feel free to mill about.